Good evening, everyone. I'm Sheila Ager, and I am Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's event. And I'll begin by reading our territorial acknowledgement. The University of Waterloo recognizes and acknowledges that its main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, land comprising 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, granted to the Haudenosaunee by the Haldeman Treaty of 1784. Both the main and the Stratford campuses are situated on land that is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We also acknowledge and recognize that this area is now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis groups. I would like to reflect very briefly on this acknowledgement before we move to tonight's lecture by adding some remarks I made at Senate a couple of months ago. The acknowledgement signifies our awareness not only that the university's campuses are located on Indigenous territorial and treaty lands, but also that treaty arrangements and relationships, while often ignored over the centuries, have never been rescinded. The land acknowledgement is genuine and sincere, but on its own it may run the risk of seeming to be performative or perfunctory. So as we move forward in our goals of relationship building with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, I believe we should take the time to reflect on the deeper meaning and purpose of the acknowledgement, that we acknowledge also the original treaties and agreements, such as the two-row wampum and the dish with one spoon wampum, and that we deepen our understanding of the uniquely Indigenous relationship with the land. Tonight's event is supported by the Foundation for Palestinian Studies Fund, which was established with the purpose of supporting activities to raise awareness and to encourage a balanced discourse on Palestinian lives and culture in the Middle East and across its diaspora. Universities play a vital role in helping society to advance. That role is rooted in academic freedom and responsibility. The freedoms to speak or express oneself and to examine, question, teach, and learn are central to our purpose. We understand that some members of the audience may be challenged by what they may hear tonight. In accordance with our policy on freedom of speech, the university expects that tonight's audience will respect the rights of others to engage in free speech without undue interference. The university stands against all forms of hate and promotion of violence. This includes anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab racism on our own campuses. We reject any form of harassment or intimidation based on someone's faith, national origin, or any aspect of their identity. I would ask you all please to maintain civility throughout the lecture and as we enter the Q&A portion of tonight's event. Pencil and paper will be distributed throughout the room for you to write down any questions, and we will be monitoring the online chat room as well. And I would now like to invite my colleague, Dr. Nathan Funk from Conrad Grebel University College, to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Greetings and good evening. We're glad to see you all here. As the Foundation for Palestine Studies Fund website underscores, the purpose of Palestinian Studies events and activities here at the University of Waterloo is to work towards understanding and towards peace. Understanding so that we can find the basis for something better for everyone. At times like these, seeking to understand is a courageous act. To step back from the noise, to zoom out, and to examine the juncture where we now stand in relation to larger processes and contexts. To explore different perspectives from that landscape, even when they bring discomfort, and to welcome opportunities to test out how many complex and uncomfortable truths our worldviews and narratives can accommodate. And perhaps also to look inward as well as outward, to acknowledge the pain and suffering that accompany our engagement. As you no doubt read from the event website, this is the first of 2 November events, each delving into conversation about culture and history from a different angle. And it's my privilege tonight to introduce Dr. Saree Makdisi, Professor and Chair of English at the University of California, Los Angeles, a prolific and accomplished scholar who has traveled quite some distance to be with us. And we might once have taken such travel for granted, but since the pandemic, we don't. We appreciate it more to have guests and to be able to be together like this, even under trying circumstances. Professor Makdisi's many academic works draw upon and synthesize insights from multiple subject areas and approaches to inquiry, including British Romanticism, imperial culture, colonial and postcolonial theory and criticism, and the cultures of urban modernity. He takes particular interest in the revision and contestation of charged urban spaces, such as London, Beirut, and Jerusalem, as well as in the afterlives of colonialism in the contemporary Arab world. Dr. Makdisi writes for newspapers and magazines as well as for academic journals and presses. The titles of his many scholarly works are indicative both of the range of his interests and of his distinctive approach to analysis. So let me recite several of these titles. Romantic Imperialism, Universal Empire and the Culture of Modernity. William Blake and the Impossible History of the 1790s. Palestine Inside Out and Everyday Occupation. Making England Western, Occidentalism, Race, and Imperial Culture. And most recently in 2022, Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial. I understand that it is this last book that will most closely inform tonight's presentation. This is a work that has generated numerous affirmative responses, but I will turn to Peter Beinart, the journalism professor, political commentator, and fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, for a characterization of the text that I find particularly relevant to this evening's conversation. Tolerance is a Wasteland, Beinart states, exposes the deep contradictions between Israel's public image and the realities Palestinians experience every day. Its argument is searing and troubling, and anyone who cares about Israel-Palestine ignores it at their peril. Professor Makdisi, thank you for coming to Waterloo to join us for this event. We look forward both to hearing your words and to engaging in conversation. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Professor Saree Makdisi.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. And so I'm just starting this thing up. And to the Foundation for making it possible, and to Jasmine and Doug for everything they've done to make the visit possible, and to the university itself for maintaining a space for open inquiry and academic freedom, because in a world like the one that we have been fated to live in, spaces for academic inquiry and free and open exchange are more vital at moments like this than at any time in history, I think. My talk tonight is, well, it's supposed to be about my most recent book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, and it will be. I will get to the book, but it's obviously impossible to say anything about Palestine these days without talking about what's happening and what's been happening for the past several weeks in the Gaza Strip. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what's happening in Gaza and then get to my book. You'll see that there is actually a relationship between not so much the events unfolding in Gaza, but rather the representation of those events in North America and other places in the West, and how the argument of my book unfolds. So you're going to be getting sort of 2 talks for the price of 1, if you see what I mean. And so I apologize for the length. It's still under an hour, but it's as I said, I'm trying to do 2 things at once. I hope you'll bear with me. What we're witnessing in Gaza today is, I think, unprecedented for reasons that I'll explain in greater detail a bit later on this evening. Since October 7th, the Israelis bombing the Gaza Strip have killed more than 13,000 people, including almost 6,000 children. a toll to which they're adding hundreds more each passing day. The true horrific scale of these numbers, of the calamity being methodically visited on an entire population while the world watches on, becomes even clearer when considered in relative terms. In just the first 3 weeks of the bombing, Israel killed more civilians than the Russians have killed in almost 2 years of war in Ukraine, a country with 20 times Gaza's population and a landmass over 1,000 times its size. Save the Children reported that Israel had killed more children in those first 3 weeks than were killed annually in all conflict zones across the entire world since 2019. And that was about 3 weeks and 3,000 children's lives ago. Israel is killing a child in Gaza every 10 minutes and injuring 4 or 5 others, often gravely, for every child that it kills. Every one of these children has or had a family, a name, a voice, a smile, a cry, a laugh. In absolute or in relative terms, whichever way we look at it, these numbers strain our moral and intellectual capacity to comprehend the scale of the loss and harm being inflicted in Gaza. And the end is nowhere in sight. On a daily basis, the Israeli government updates the tally of what it calls terrorist facilities, terrorist infrastructure, terrorist positions, and terrorist cells that it claims to have eliminated. Live footage coming from the ruins of Gaza's shattered neighborhoods, however, reveal an altogether different reality, which is to say, the starkness of reality itself. Not just apartment buildings, but whole districts have been reduced to rubble. Craters 20 meters across and 10 meters deep, where survivors work desperately to rescue people trapped beneath hunks of cement, and a moonscape, a man-made moonscape, of desolation and ruin. In video after video, teams of untrained and unequipped civilians can be seen struggling to help ambulance crews retrieve the injured from the ruins of what had been, just a few weeks ago, their homes, including terrified, bloodied, screaming children with ash-covered faces, crying for their now vanished parents. Terrorist targets is the constant Israeli refrain, but the video feeds and images coming out of Gaza show only the broken and bloody bodies of fathers, mothers, and children. From one scene of carnage and devastation to another across the terrorist targets constituting Gaza's terrorist landscape, the cameras show us survivors emerging from the shambles asking what they did to have been bombed without warning. In many cases, the same families have been bombed repeatedly. Al Jazeera interviewed a man the other day who had just lost his children in an Israeli bombing. "And your wife?" the reporter asked. "I lost her last week along with my brother and his children," the man said. The statements, the evidence, keep repeating themselves. They keep saying, what did we do? Why did they keep doing this to us? There were no fighters among us. There was no resistance activity anywhere nearby. Why did they bomb us? There is only one conceivable answer to that question, to which we will shortly return. They are bombing you because you exist. Israeli bombers have attacked mosques and churches, including one of the oldest Greek Orthodox churches in the Eastern Mediterranean. They have bombed schools and universities. 279 educational institutions have been damaged or destroyed. They have struck ambulances even at the very doors of hospitals, as well as hospitals themselves. On November 9th and 10th, 5 major hospitals came under direct Israeli fire. Al-Rantisi Hospital, which is a children's hospital, the Baptist Ahli Hospital, the Indonesian Hospital, Al-Quds, and Al-Shifa Medical Center. By nightfall of the 10th, all the hospitals in the north of Gaza reported being under Israeli artillery and missile fire. Showers of incendiary phosphorus just outside, buildings heaving with successive explosions, showering all within with dust and debris, and in some cases shrapnel. Israeli snipers were reported to be firing into the hospitals themselves. Tens of thousands of terrified refugees had been sheltering in these hospitals, and those who tried leaving both the Rantisi and the Shifa on November the 10th were fired at by Israeli troops or drones and had to return under fire. Both hospitals were reporting bodies scattered in the streets outside beyond the reach of medics, who also came under fire when attempting rescue. By the morning of November 11th at Shifa Medical Center, the largest medical institution in Gaza and older than Israel itself, was out of service due to Israeli fire. No water, no electricity, no lights, no fuel, no medicine, and under relentless bombardment. 600 gravely injured patients could no longer be treated. With 39 premature babies in incubators and other intensive care patients on ventilators and with no electricity, staff resorted to attempting manual resuscitation, but knew that without oxygen, they had little chance. Some of the babies died. All of the patients in intensive care were reported to have died. The hospital director, Muhammad Abu Salmiya, pledged that the medical staff would stay with their patients to the end. "We will not leave," he said, "because we know that if we leave, dozens of patients will die." Doctors like Ghassan Abu Sitta and teams of nurses went from one hospital to another as each one was put out of action. They went to the next one to see if they could help. Abu Sitta ended up in the Baptist hospital and stayed there for as long as there was something that he could do, operating on patients without anesthetic. But when that hospital too was reduced to what the WHO, the World Health Organization, has called the death zone, he had to give up at last. The last semi-functional hospital in northern Gaza was the Indonesian hospital, and today that came under very heavy direct Israeli artillery fire, killing 12 people in the hospital. They hit the operating room specifically, and it too is now out of service. From now on, anyone injured in all of the north of Gaza, which still has, we don't know, 100 or 200,000 people at least still in it, not to mention people who need routine medical care, people like cancer or dialysis patients. We forget about them in a war, but people still exist who have other routine needs for care. People suffering heart attacks or strokes, pregnant women with complications, or newborns who need assistance to live. All of these people in the north of Gaza have no access to medical care at all. Anybody injured is almost certain to die, and Israel's bombs continue to fall. 4 days ago, Israeli forces stormed Al-Shifa hospital, which Israel has adamantly insisted for years is the main operational headquarters of Hamas, just as it has insisted for years that the other hospitals, including the Rantisi Children's Hospital, operated as Hamas command and control bases. For years, both Hamas and these hospitals, as well as local and foreign doctors like Ghassan Abu Sitta and Mads Gilbert, have denied these claims. When Israel finally had the chance to validate its claims, like this video that you just saw, about these hospitals by storming them, it produced a set of videos that fall about halfway between the comical and the almost painfully risible. One of these shows an Israeli officer in the basement of the Rantisi Children's Hospital pointing out what he claims is a roster of Hamas guards, he says. In the video he says, these are all the names of the Hamas guards, who he says, therefore, this is evidence that they were holding some of the Israeli prisoners here. But anybody with even a passing knowledge of Arabic can tell you that that's not a list of guards or names, it's a makeshift calendar of the days of the week. I mean, you would think that if they're going to do this, it would at least get somebody who knows Arabic to fake this stuff or to come up with a better story. I don't know, but that's what they did. The propaganda video released following Israel's raid into the Shifa hospital, which after days of rummaging through the hospital came up with like 6 guns and some WD-40 and a bag, they said that this is proof that it was headquarters of Hamas or something like that. But again, there's no evidence at all of the kind of James Bond-like structure that you saw in that video that they made before the war. And it was so badly and clumsily edited and doctored that even The Guardian, the BBC, and the CNN, which are outlets normally sympathetic to Israel, dismissed it as unconvincing, which is putting it mildly. These facilities were manifestly not the military targets that Israel had claimed that they were. Its attacks on these hospitals were the most obvious evidence, by its own witless admission, of its grave violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention and hence their war crimes. Nevertheless, when the Israelis rolled their tanks into the courtyard of the Shifa hospital, they made a big show, again like something out of a Monty Python sketch, of the boxes conspicuously marked in huge English letters, medical supplies. And Joe Biden said that they were bringing incubators for the premature babies. In fact, the Israeli army supplied neither incubators, nor medical supplies, nor food, nor water, nor fuel, nor anything else to the hundreds of patients and doctors and thousands of other people sheltering in the hospital. It led away at gunpoint boys and men over the age of 16 to an uncertain fate. It even dug up the mass grave that the doctors had had to resort to at one point to bury the dead because the morgues without electricity were not fit for function. And then it sealed the hospital off for 3 days as humanitarian conditions and people's injuries got worse and people began to die of hunger and thirst. Finally, the other day, the Israeli army gave everyone, men, women, children, old people, the gravely wounded alike, 1 hour to evacuate the hospital and embark on the mass exodus along with other Palestinians on the 15-kilometer walk to the south of Gaza, which they say is a safe zone, but is also being bombed. Today, there are only about 250 severely injured people remaining in the hospital, the Shifa hospital, with a few doctors and nurses to attend to them, and their fate remains unknown. Israel's treatment of the wounded and the civilians sheltering in Gaza's hospitals, which is not much less than sadistic, is further evidence, if anyone needed it, that what we're witnessing in Gaza is not self-defense, it's an opportunistic offensive. It's not a war, the term used mendaciously and misleadingly by most of the mainstream Western press. It's a campaign of genocidal violence. Indeed, it is, as Craig Mukhaiber put it in his letter resigning from his role as the director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a textbook case of genocide. Words that have been echoed by many scholars of genocide and the Holocaust. Genocide is, after all, the term that international law provides for a situation in which one group imposes on another, quote from the convention, conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, in addition to, quote, causing serious bodily and mental harm to members of the group, which I think we can see is being done to the people in Gaza. Beyond the 13,000 people killed so far, the UN has estimated that more than a quarter of a million residential units have been damaged or destroyed in Gaza, amounting to about half of the entire housing in the entire area. And 1.7 million people have been displaced from their homes. Gaza's basic infrastructure of electricity, water, and sewage networks, repeatedly battered in previous Israeli bombings, has now been taken altogether beyond repair. Newly installed solar panels have been deliberately targeted and smashed. Israel has targeted and destroyed the bakeries producing the staple on which the population depends for its very survival. It has bombed the fishermen's boats, which are, or were, another potential source of nourishment. It has bombed the fields and greenhouses that sustain Gaza's surviving agriculture. It has bombed water conduits and reservoirs. People are forced to drink dirty, polluted, contaminated, or brackish water with the inevitable results of diarrhea and disease. Retired Israeli General Giora Eiland wrote the other day, yesterday, he wrote, I'm quoting him here, the international community warns us, he says, and I'm quoting him here, the international community warns us of a humanitarian disaster in Gaza and of severe epidemic. We must not shy away from this. After all, severe epidemics in the south of Gaza will bring victory closer. End of quotation. I don't think you need 17 PhDs in literary theory to understand what that means when he says something like that. Epidemics will help us win. Already, hundreds of corpses are rotting under the rubble or lying in the streets picked at by stray dogs. Whoever survives the bombing today will be drinking seawater and eating unbaked wheat in the future, if not starving or dying of the diseases already proliferating from the raw sewage running through the streets of Gaza. And there will be nowhere for them to live. There will be no hospitals to sustain their lives, no schools to educate them. Every last detail of this catalog of horrors is the result of careful and meticulously premeditated Israeli planning by the likes of this guy, and made possible by the unblinking support of Western governments. Indeed, the Western governments rushing financial support and more bombs to Israel, making themselves accomplices to all of its atrocities and its grotesque violations of international humanitarian law, seem to have no qualms about what it is that they're supporting. All this carnage, we're told in sanctimonious terms from across the Western political class, is merely Israel's right to self-defense. There is, however, no understanding of the concept of self-defense that includes withholding the basics of survival from a population for whose welfare one is legally responsible, which Israel is as the occupying power, a point reiterated in countless UN Security Council resolutions. As Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, has repeatedly pointed out, a state cannot claim the right of self-defense from territory that it militarily controls and from people on whom it has chosen to impose a brutal occupation since 1967. In any case, Israeli politicians have been using an altogether different language than that of self-defense to describe their actions. The Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, put it with his characteristic and unsophisticated crudeness as early as October 9th when he said, "We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food," this is him, I'm quoting him again, "no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel, everything is closed. We are fighting," I continue to quote him, "we are fighting human animals, and we will act accordingly." Giora Island, whom I quoted a minute ago, wishing for epidemics to speed up Israeli victory, says in cold newspaper print that Israel's target isn't just the fighters of Hamas, but, to quote him, the entire population of Gaza. If this leaves any room for doubt as to Israel's intent, which is usually the hardest part of a claim of genocide to prove, it is allayed by Benjamin Netanyahu's repeated reminders to the Israeli public and the Israeli army that, quoting Netanyahu, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you," says our Holy Bible. His biblical reference is unmistakable. It's to a passage in the Bible that concludes with a commandment from God that reads, "Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." But this is 2023, and we do not live in the Bible. What kind of people talk like this, with a godlike sense of their power over literally millions of other people? What mindset produces such proclamations on the disposition of entire populations? What we're witnessing before our eyes is, as I said earlier, unprecedented in the history of colonial warfare. Ethnic cleansing in itself is unfortunately not as rare an occasion as one would like. Only a few weeks ago, 130,000 Armenians were driven from their homes in Arsat by, not coincidentally, Israeli-armed Azerbaijan. In the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, thousands of people of the so-called wrong religion or ethnicity were expelled at a time from their communities in Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. Almost all, 90% of the Christian and Muslim population of Palestine itself was ethnically cleansed by Zionist forces in 1948. And of course, we can go back to the 18th and 19th centuries, the 17th century, and recall the sordid history of genocide, extermination, and slavery with which Western civilization made its enlightened presence felt all around the planet, including here in the unceded indigenous territories of North America. But in no instance that I know of has ethnic cleansing been accomplished through the use of massive ordnance and heavy bombardment with ultra-modern weapon systems, live-streamed on television, Twitter, and TikTok, and aided and abetted by all the white Western governments. What we are witnessing, in other words, is the first fusion of old-school colonial and genocidal violence with advanced state-of-the-art heavy weaponry and televised to a global audience. It's a twisted amalgamation of the 17th century and the 21st, packaged and wrapped up in language that harkens back to primitive times and thunderous biblical scenes involving the smiting of whole populations. What's worse, if anything could be worse, is the nearly total indifference on display by so many in and out of governments in the Western world. Given the shock and outrage over the Palestinian killing of Israeli civilians on October 7th that's been expressed by journalists, politicians, governments, and university presidents, the nearly blanket silence concerning the fate of Palestinian civilians at the hands of the Israeli state is deafening. It's thunderous. It's a bellowing silence. We who live in Western countries didn't support or pay for any Palestinian to kill any Israeli civilian. But every bomb dropped on Gaza is supplied by us, and it's dropped from aircraft that we provided. It's added to a bill that we pay for, and the officials that we voted for are falling over themselves to join in the encouragement of the bombing and rush the delivery of new bombs to replace the ones already dropped. It's not just the Western governments, however. Despite the remarkable, truly remarkable, and I'll come back to it later on, the remarkable mass mobilizations and outrage and protests and demonstrations and sit-ins and teach-ins that we see expressed in the streets of every major Western city, there are around us certain people who, desperately moved by the images and narratives of Israeli suffering on October 7th, have nothing to say about Palestinian suffering on a far greater scale, to which they simply turn a blind eye. How can anyone be so heartless? And I'm not talking here about overt racists who explicitly call for the destruction of Gaza and the expulsion of the Palestinians. I'm talking about ordinary people, many, maybe even most of them, solid liberals in the American sense of that term. When it comes to politics, they are advocates of gender and racial equality. They're anxious about climate change, concerned for the homeless, insistent on wearing face masks out of humane consideration for others, voters for the most progressive of politicians. What we are seeing when we see people like this is not heartlessness. These people have plenty of heart. It is rather one manifestation of a much broader culture of denial. The reason that people like this seem not to recognize or to see Palestinian suffering is that they really do not see it or recognize it. They are far too intent, far too focused on the suffering of people with whom they can much more readily identify, people that they understand to be just like themselves, with a scene of suffering that, with all the logic of a monopoly, occludes, that is, overshadows, displaces, removes from sight, hides from view, any other kind of suffering with which it might otherwise be seen to compete. And if anyone brings that occluded suffering of the Palestinians back to view, the reaction is one of anger. Why are you telling me to look at this instead of joining me in my outrage about that? Can you not see that? Thus, the mechanism of occlusion is restored once more. My book, Palestine is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial, offers an exploration of a series of such mechanisms of occlusion and denial that allow us to understand once and for all the mindset of those people who take a progressive political stance on everything in the world except the question of Palestine. How I, and I'm sure many of you have often wondered, how can a liberal Western subject endorse ethnic cleansing and apartheid? How can one reconcile a commitment to democracy and civil rights with one's support for a state that practices apartheid? How can one balance one's support for the separation of church and state, one of the core Western values, with one's support for a state in which the lack of such a distinction is a founding premise? How can one reconcile one's belief in civil marriage and women's rights with a state that has no institution of civil marriage and imposes ancient theocratic restrictions on the rights of married women? One's affirmation of a culture of inclusion with a political system premised on brute exclusion. These acts of contradiction are not mere hypocrisy, any more than the people who mourn the loss of Israeli life but turn a blind eye to the loss of Palestinian life are hypocritical. Hypocrisy involves a kind of self-knowledge, and what we're talking about here is a form of denial, not awareness. Two forms of denial need to be taken into account here. The first is basic, the sort of the normal understanding of the word denial, refusing facts, refusing narratives, refusing evidence, and so on. For example, there were no Palestinians, we used to be told. Ethnic cleansing didn't happen, the Nakba never took place, it's very complicated, etc. You've heard these things before. What William Blake once called the mind-forged manacles of discourses of terrorism, Islamist militants, and so on. This form of denial was once readily, and still is sometimes, readily enabled by Western journalism, by the long absence of Palestinian narratives, the Palestinian lack of English, and so on, though all of those circumstances have been changing. In any case, ignoring, looking aside, refusing to recognize, these are difficult to sustain on their own, especially in the face of a massive archive of evidence to the contrary, and they provide no basis for the elaboration of a liberal sense of self. Something more is needed to enable a liberal subject to reconcile her support for Zionism with her commitment to liberal values, which ought to be antithetical to Zionism. Equality, justice, freedom, rights, those kinds of things. Essential to this miraculous act of political alchemy, I argue in the book, is a very specific form of denial, in which the Palestinian presence in and claim to Palestine, as well as Zionism's role in violently attempting to negate that claim, are not simply refused, covered up, or negated outright. Rather, they are occluded in such a way that the act of denial is itself denied by being expressed as an act of affirmation of various civic virtues that can be believed in. And I know that sounds complicated, but I'll give you some examples that will help it sink in a minute. Thus, for example, although very few people, and even fewer self-avowed liberals or leftists, would knowingly support and invest emotionally in a state that openly flaunts its methodical demolition of entire villages after their inhabitants had been driven in terror from their homes, many progressives would happily be able to support a state that claims that all it does is plant trees and greens an apparently barren landscape and loudly claims to make the desert bloom. Well then, what if the bulldozing of houses is both materially and figuratively covered up by, in fact, transacted precisely through the process of planting trees over their ruins in order to occlude the constitutive act of violence? A state that engages in, that announces itself as a project of greening the landscape, making the desert bloom, inventing clever new forms of irrigation and so on, would and does, or has, attract all the necessary ethical, emotional, financial, and political support that it needs from liberal supporters who would never for a moment contemplate endorsing a project of ethnic cleansing and home demolition as such. The emphasis of the positive value, making the desert bloom, or planting trees, or afforestation, or whatever, doesn't just make it possible to overlook the dark history occluded by the act of joyous affirmation. It makes the dark history possible in the first place. It nourishes it and sustains it over the years. The picture you see behind me is a picture of, in the background, the forest planted by the Jewish National Fund over the ruins of the Palestinian village of Safuri in Galilee. And in the foreground, you can see somebody holding up on a calendar a picture of the village as it was before it was ethnically cleansed in 1948. In fact, if you look at the very, very crown of the hill, you see that the building, the square building at the very top, peeping through the trees. You can recognize the same building in the picture of the village below. What's needed then is we all need a village. What's needed then is a set of values to affirm in a positive sense, or better yet, a set of values to affirm the very affirmation of which transacts denial in such a way that the act of denial is doubly or even triply invisible. First, because you deny it in the most basic sense. There were no Palestinians, there was no ethnic cleansing, there was no home demolition, there was no Nakba, and so on. Second, because your denial is so sweeping and comprehensive that it is itself denied. And finally, because the act of affirming this positive value, and we'll go through a series of them in a minute, is so hyperbolic, it's so exaggerated, so theatrically overperformed, that it completely occludes the act of denial that it simultaneously expresses. The book is more interested in this more complicated form of denial, not just sort of brute, no, it didn't happen, although that's important, this other form of denial that's so comprehensive, so complete, that it cannot recognize itself as a form of denial in the first place. It erases its own traces, what I call in the book, the denial of denial. So how does this form of denial work? And now I think you'll start to see by the end what the connection to Gaza is. Although it's still partly enabled by and dependent on that other simpler kind of denial, lack of information, this form of denial works by affirming, as I said, a positive value. Tolerance, for example, or democracy, or heritage, or sustainability, or diversity. It relies on a system working diligently in the background to produce these effects, writing scripts, packaging narratives, suppressing other narratives, and so on. So I'll give you some examples from the book, and obviously the first I've already kind of broached, which is the transformation of the landscape of Palestine in the aftermath of the ethnic cleansing, the Nakba of 1948. After the Zionist militias that would eventually coalesce into the Israeli army completed their expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Palestine, the terrain left behind was a landscape of empty houses. Very often, as in this case, the village of Lifta, still intact to this day and undamaged, complete with all the contents of Palestinian domestic life, from the urbane to the humble and rustic. This landscape had to be remade in the image of the new Jewish state. And the first step, which actually took many years, and as I said, remains incomplete in some places, was the demolition of Palestinian homes, mosques, churches, and cemeteries, as well as the methodical extirpation of the cultivated landscape of citrus and olive groves and prickly pear cactuses, the indigenous landscape to which those homes and other spaces once corresponded. No sooner had Palestinian villages been demolished, bulldozed, dynamited, bombed from the air, then the agencies and auxiliaries of the new state, in particular the Jewish National Fund, started planting forests over their ruins. And I mean that quite literally, as you saw with the village of Safuri. Forests over the ruins. Demolish the village first, and then plant a forest right on top of the ruins to make the village, the ruins of the village, blend into the landscape like it was never there. The weird thing is they also put in picnic tables so that Israeli citizens can go to this demolished village and sit in the forest and have picnics, which I personally think is somewhat macabre, but that's me. Unlike the demolition of family homes, which was done as quietly as possible, the project of tree planting over the ruins of these now unmentioned, disappeared, erased from all maps, villages was and still is carried out with much fanfare and under the banner of grand proclamations. People, particularly but not only Jewish people, are invited to, as the slogan has it, plant a tree in Israel. This is the website of the Jewish National Fund. To donate funds for tree planting, to make the desert bloom, to visit ceremonial tree planting sites in Israel where they can actively participate in this quite literally wonderful endeavor. As though by magic, then, a project of ethnic cleansing and home demolition has been transformed into one of family-centered tree planting. And by virtue of that transformation, it has secured the support that it needs from implicated subjects who would never knowingly lend their support to a process of mass eviction and home demolition, but do lend their support as long as it's disavowed and almost literally unknown or turned into something positive and affirmative like greening the landscape. The deliberate and systematically worked through occlusion of the Palestinian presence in and hence claim to the land has thus been occluded itself by a transformative act of affirmation to which hyperbolic levels of acclaim and attention are drawn. The second chapter talks about the mantra of the Jewish and democratic state, and it begins by asking the question, who could be against democracy? Especially what we're often told is the only democracy in the Middle East. What could possibly be wrong with the affirmation with affirming the value of a Jewish and democratic state? That's the question addressed as I said, in the second chapter, which opens with the discussion of the often repeated mantra, particularly prominent in US politics, in support of a Jewish and democratic state. The phrase is repeated as such, always a Jewish and democratic state. It comes up again and again and again in US, I don't know about Canadian, but in US political discourse, again and again. We affirm a Jewish and democratic state, a Jewish and democratic state, a Jewish and democratic state. It's always in that formula. The repetition of the mantra, of that formula, its obviously self-contradictory, even oxymoronic status invisible to its proponents, because a state can't be simultaneously for a particular group, a Jewish state, and for everyone, a democracy. It's one or the other. But the oxymoron occludes a far more complex politics of systematic racial segregation inside the pre-67 state, as well as, obviously even more starkly, the territories occupied in 1967. In fact, as I show in the chapter, a point-by-point comparison with both international legal instruments, above all the Apartheid Convention, and with apartheid-era South Africa shows that the Israeli state is in a clinical, not in a rhetorical or emotional sense, in a clinical and legal sense, an apartheid state. And this has been supported, substantiated recently by reports by a UN agency and by massive reports published by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in the past couple of years. Here then we can see occlusion at work in a structure similar to that explored in the previous chapter. The repeated invocation of the apparently magic phrase Jewish and democratic state occludes the harsh reality of an apartheid state. That is, the affirmation of the positive value, Jewish democracy, displaces and occludes not only the denial of those Palestinians expelled from their homes and denied the right of return, which is the condition of possibility for the foundation of Israel as a Jewish state, but also the civil and political rights of those Palestinians who survived the Nakba and who are now second-class citizens of the state and subject to an array of discriminatory laws and live in what is a profoundly racial state, which is, of course, the condition of possibility for maintaining the exclusive state as it is. Again, as the other chapters show, what's clear is that no self-identified liberal subject would knowingly endorse apartheid. You can't both be liberal and for human rights and so forth and support apartheid. So what I am doing in this way as a liberal subject, I support democracy. I don't support apartheid. And it's my affirmation of this Jewish and democratic state that enlists and enables my support for the reality, which is in fact apartheid. So you see how the mechanism of denial works. I'm not supporting this, I'm supporting that, but the that is enabled by the this. That's how the logic works. One last example, then I'll stop talking about the book, which is the third chapter from which the book derives its title. It's the origin and heart of the book. It centers on an almost unbelievable moment in the history of specifically American Zionist emotional and political investment in Israel. In 2004, the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, which is down the street from where I live, announced that it was planning to open a branch in Jerusalem. The museum hired the noted LA-based architect Frank Gehry to design its Jerusalem branch. And they developed very elaborate interior designs for the display spaces, in which, despite the name of the museum, because it was to be called the Museum of Tolerance in Jerusalem, actually had nothing to do with the word tolerance as we understand that word in the English language, but rather with the history of Zionism. In other words, it was actually a history of Zionism, but it calls itself a Museum of Tolerance. And I'll come back to that in a second. In fact, more specifically still, it purports to be a history of the Jewish people, but packaged as though there's nothing in Jewish history other than Zionism, ultimately, and hence kind of teleologically leading all of Jewish history, the thousands of years of Jewish history, the philosophy, the artists, the incredible accomplishments in music and art and everything else, and literature. This is all to take us, according to the museum, towards the destination, which is Zionism. But it's not a museum of Zionism, it's a museum of tolerance. Anyway, it turns out that the museum was being built on the site of the largest and most important Muslim cemetery in all of Palestine, which was in active use until the middle of the 20th century. And I personally know people with family members buried there. Of course, I say it turns out that this was the site, but of course Muslims and locals in Jerusalem had been protesting this from the beginning, but they were just ignored by the Jerusalem municipality and by the Museum of Tolerance in LA. So when the building's planners found out that workers were indeed excavating bones and other human remains, which would normally trigger a stop to the excavation, they surrounded the site with hoarding, hired only Jewish excavators, and pressed ahead. Inevitably, despite all the attempts at a cover-up, the scandal blew into the open. These people were building a museum of tolerance on somebody else's graveyard from which human remains were hastily being disinterred and unceremoniously discarded in unmarked cardboard boxes. I mean, it's like, you couldn't make this kind of stuff up. It's kind of amazing. But the most extraordinary thing is that the Museum of Tolerance refuses, to this day, it categorically refuses to see what's wrong. It insists on pushing ahead, it insisted on pushing ahead with the project on an accelerated timetable. It actually took them 20 years. This is where I played my own minor role in this story. I wrote an opinion piece about this project for the LA Times and an essay about it for the journal Critical Inquiry. And the journal invited Frank Gehry himself, the architect, to reply to my article, which he did. He was very angry. It was very deeply unpleasant. And he got some other people to denounce me in the journal too, and there was this kind of ugly back and forth. That was in May 2010. And just as our debate was about to be published by the journal, Frank Gehry suddenly announced that he was withdrawing his services from the museum project. And over that summer, I received a number of calls from his office saying he wanted to meet. And I didn't really want to meet him because it had been unpleasant talking to him in print, and like, what was the point? Anyway, we finally met in September 2010. And in that meeting, he explained to me that he'd been misled by the museum people, that he did not know that his building was being built on the site of a cemetery. And I believe him. I think he's an honest man. And that my article had helped clarify the situation and helped him withdraw from the project, but that he can't say that in public. But my role in this episode, and even Gary's role, is not the focus of the chapter, which is instead interested in the question of what it means that a museum of tolerance could be forcibly implanted on the hastily excavated ruins of a Muslim cemetery in such a way that, despite all the publicity and protest, those responsible and their backers, not coincidentally, heavily connected to liberal circles in Los Angeles and to Hollywood in particular. For example, George Clooney is a close collaborator with this institution. George Clooney, the guy of the human rights, right? They simply couldn't see what's wrong with what they're doing. In fact, they persisted with the project ever since, and after all these years, they finally opened the museum last year. And the first speaker in it was the governor of Florida, who gave a speech saying that, I don't know, something about Palestinians that was very unpleasant. So the museum episode offers a sort of encapsulated version of the overall argument of the book. In this case, the Palestinian claim to a cemetery is being denied. That denial is itself denied by the attempt to literally cover it up, and then by other layers of denial, but mostly by the hyperbolic and theatricalized investment in a discourse of tolerance. For Zionism, we are told by this institution, is a mission of tolerance. To question or to oppose Zionism is therefore to engage in, you guessed it, intolerance. The chapter argues that this militarized deployment of a discourse of tolerance expresses a broader set of patterns of affirming positive values, in this case tolerance, in the other cases in the other chapters democracy or making the landscape green or whatever, as a means of occluding the denial of the Palestinian presence in and claim to Palestine. Really, however, what the book traces is what is, in effect, an archaeology of an emotional and political, a psychogeographical formation that is rapidly disappearing before our eyes. What I set out to explore in the book is the contradiction between Israel as a racial, colonial, and apartheid state on the one hand, and Israel as the object of affection of the European and particularly North American left from at least the 1960s onwards. For several reasons, that contradiction is beginning to resolve itself. On an international level, the Palestinian struggle is now much more closely affiliated with movements for rights and equality by other marginalized or dispossessed peoples, and gaining, therefore, in popular support and the sympathy of the left, including, for example, by affiliation with indigenous rights struggles or Black Lives Matter in the US and so on. Israel has concomitantly seen its base of support shift from the left to the right, nowhere more clearly than in the US. US support for Israel is based, we have to remember, not really on national interest, but on the mobilization and maintenance of broad-based popular domestic support. For most of the years since at least the 60s, American support for Israel has been premised on a narrative of shared values, liberal principles, a common status as supposedly Western liberal states, and so on, a narrative that has resonated most strongly, obviously, in liberal sectors of the US society. Only in the very recent past, since 9/11, Has the justification of that support been articulated more in terms of war, antagonism to Islam, fighting terrorism, and so forth? An argument that in general appeals more to the right wing and to adherents of the Republican Party in the US than it does to liberals and the Democratic Party, where traditionally, for decades, support for Israel had been strongest. Indeed, before our very eyes, support for Israel on the left or liberal end of the political spectrum in North America and Europe is waning quickly, even as it is growing on the right. In response to this shift, or kind of dialectically related to it, Israel itself has been unpeeling one layer after another of the forms of denial and equivocation that formerly gave it cover among its left-leaning supporters overseas, thereby enabling that support in the first place, that is, the forms of denial that I explore in my book. In 2018, for example, the Israeli parliament passed the Jewish nation-state law, which made explicit certain formerly implicit forms of racial discrimination against non-Jewish citizens of the state. In material terms, the law changed nothing. It just simply affirmed explicitly what had been there all along, quietly. The Israeli Prime Minister and other major politicians have repeatedly and explicitly said that Palestinian, they call them Arab, but Palestinian citizens can look elsewhere for the fulfillment of their national aspirations, rather than continuing with the fiction that Israel is an inclusive democratic state. Rather than perpetuating previous governments' nominal or verbal commitments to a two-state solution, the present government has committed itself to the annexation of some or all of the territory occupied in 1967, without admitting Palestinians resident on that territory to citizenship, in other words, to formal rather than implicit apartheid. This shift from denial, equivocation, and agonizing hair-splitting to the outright embrace of explicit racism is hugely significant. The state's calculation seems to be that the era of denial is over, that we have shifted globally to a world of violent, racist, right-wing populism, that it's better to go with the shifting tide than to hang on to something else. This shift, in other words, amounts to the admission of the claim that the forms of denial explored in my book no longer work, that they correspond to a different era, that we have moved on from affirmations of sharing, equality, cooperation, and solidarity to a much harsher world of racism, inequality, and brutal violence, with which, of course, I don't agree. The bet that the Israeli state has made is that it can do away with the trappings of liberalism and progressivism and just come out as the violent racial enterprise that it was all along, securing new support for itself among those committed in North America and Europe to building walls, deporting immigrants, breaking up families, violently policing minority communities, and crushing dissent. In committing itself to this new nakedly racist agenda of violence and religious and cultural antagonism, suppression of rights, and so forth, the current Israeli state has abandoned all those forms of denial that sustained the Zionist project for decades. Which brings us back, finally, by way of conclusion, to the catastrophe unfolding in Gaza right now. It's true that in the short term, the Israeli state has garnered all the support that it needs from the major Western powers, above all the US. The Biden administration, as I'm sure you know, has been rushing extra finance, weapons, and ammunition to Israel, including diverting tens of thousands of artillery shells that had been destined for Ukraine and that will now be rained down on the civilian population of Gaza instead. But ordinary Americans, like people elsewhere around the world, are increasingly able to see through the layers of mystification and denial, as well as their own government's positions. Every bomb that Israel drops on Gaza sets its own cause back by one step or more in Western public opinion. A recent poll in the US showed that a solid majority of Americans, including a majority of Republicans and an overwhelming majority of Democrats, think that their government should back a call for a ceasefire in Gaza, which, as you know, is not US government policy. And if you back up to polling data before the current crisis, it's clear that support for the Israeli state was already quickly plummeting, especially among young voters who represent the future of American politics and no longer drink the drink served up by the likes of the New York Times and CNN. A University of Maryland Ipsos poll this past spring asking Americans how they would characterize the Israeli state found a majority answering that they don't know. which is, by the way, which is already an interesting thing because we're always told it's a democratic and Jewish and democratic state, again and again and again and again. So you would think with all of that bombardment, if anybody in the US is asked, what do you think of this state? They will say, well, it's a Jewish and democratic state. But now people are saying, the majority say, I don't know. But if you strip away the I don't know answers, the results are startling. 22% of respondents, but only 6% of Democratic voters think that the state is a vibrant democracy. 31%, including almost half of Democratic voters, think that it is a state with, quote, with segregation similar to apartheid. In other words, this is last spring. Almost half of Democratic voters in the US think that Israel is an apartheid state. And that's, how are they thinking? It's not in the news, it's not in the newspapers, it's not in the government, it's not in the Congress. If you dare to say these kinds of things, you get screamed at in the US, and yet somehow, half of Democratic voters recognize it as an apartheid state. How? How are people able to see through government positions, blanket censorship in journalism, or mendacious and misleading abuses of the English language and so forth? How can people see reality for itself? How can they penetrate through what Blake once called the mind-forged manacles to see reality? Well, I mean, partly the answer is the picture behind me. You don't need to have 26 PhDs in political science to figure out what's happening when you see a picture like that. It's clear what's happening, especially if you get your news, as young people do, not from watching CNN or reading the New York Times or the Globe and Mail or whatever, but by Twitter and TikTok, which is basically video, if you think about it. If you look across just North America at the mass demonstrations expressing solidarity with the Palestinian cause, at the blocking of major roads, highways, bridges, transport hubs, at the students in universities across the continent and in Europe too, shrugging off the threats of doxing and intimidation, what you will see is that that Israel has lost America, certainly young America, once and for all. In the short term, then, the Israeli state feels emboldened by the support it's received from the US and other Western governments to continue with the bombardment of Gaza, an act of vengeful and almost literally mindless bloodletting, killing for the sake of killing, that does not seem connected to any rational military or political plan or formula. In the long term, however, things look very different, and the current devastation in Gaza could prove to mark the end for broad-based popular support, and hence ultimately for governmental support for the Zionist project in Palestine. That, combined with the inexorable decline in American power that we're on a global scale, that we're witnessing in a variety of other sites, gives cause for future optimism for anyone committed to a just peace and equality for all in Palestine, even though the present looks so desolate and bleak. Thank you. Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Doug Peers. I'm a member of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Waterloo, and it's my great honor and pleasure to be the moderator for the question and answer period. And we have about 20 minutes or so. I am going to be occasionally checking my device because through the wonders of technology, our online audience is also sending questions which will be sent to me. And my colleague Jasmine Habib will be collecting the questions that people have raised, and I'll try and get as many and as much variety of questions to our speaker as possible. Well, I'll let him first of all have some water, so I'll pause slowly. Actually, the first question I'll read, it's a lengthy two-part one, so that'll allow Professor Makdisi to get a good swig of water. First question is, what role does discourse in the context on campus play in education on the ongoing conflict? And related to that, what responsibilities do Western-based universities and public institutions hold in allowing the both sides, if there are both sides, of the discourse to exist?
I mean, that's a very important question. I can't speak to the status or what's going on at Canadian universities because that's not that you know more about than I do. But I can tell you about American university campuses. And what's been very interesting to witness as an American academic over the past 30 years that I've been teaching in the US is that there's a massive array of Zionist institutions kind of policing and patrolling our campuses and trying to trying to suppress forms of criticism and debate and so forth. So there's a massive attempt at suppressing academic freedom in the US. And you can witness that, I mean, in the current crisis, for example, the banning of chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine, for example, which has happened at a couple of universities on the east coast of the US, including the banning of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is remarkable, at one campus. I think it was Brown or Columbia University did that. That kind of thing, those sorts of acts of repression are unfortunately more common than they ought to be. And I think what they speak to is a sense that people who support the Zionist cause know that academically speaking, they don't have an argument anymore. In other words, there used to be a debate as to what happened in 1948 or 1967 or 1973 or whatever. And those debates, academically speaking, are done and dusted. Nobody, no serious academic, any longer questions what happened during the Nakba of 1948. Everybody knows, academically speaking, there was an ethnic cleansing. There's no question about it. But there are forces that are still trying to deny that that's what took place. And so what they want to do is to suppress these kinds of viewpoints from taking place and having room on campus. And so campuses have turned from places of what they ought to be, freedom of expression and so forth, to places of surveillance and curtailing of arguments and so forth. As to the question about the two sides thing, so it's interesting that often, for example, if somebody gives a talk about Palestine, one of the knee-jerk responses from people on campus who support the Zionist cause say, but this is unbalanced, why is he saying this? There should be somebody to balance him and so forth. And of course, what they never say is that, do all events need to have two sides? If we're going to have, for example, somebody speaking about, I don't know, global warming, do we have to have a climate change denier also there to balance their point of view? If we're going to talk about evolution, do we need to have a flat earther there to deny their point of view? I mean, at what point do you say, that's not the function of a university? The whole point of a university is that it's meant to encompass the universe of views and approaches and forms of thought that are out there in the world. So my point of view personally is I think Zionists should absolutely have their own talks, their own sessions, their own marches, their own seminars, conferences, whatever they want. Let them, I have no problem at all. Let them go ahead and do that. But let us also say what we want to say, and then we'll see which way the world is going to go, basically. So leave it open to this contest. I'm not a big fan of the market in general, but leave it to the market of ideas, as to use that expression, and let the market decide, who's right and who's wrong. And I have no worries about it, but unfortunately, they do, and hence the attempt to suppress freedom of thought in the US.
Okay. A solution proposed by Omer Bartov is a federation of Palestine and Israel. Is that possible, viable, in your opinion?
I mean, a federation, I'm not a political scientist, but it seems to me that a federation would be problematic because it would quickly put one entity in a position of superiority and power vis-a-vis the other. So that's problematic. What I personally have been arguing for 30 years in public is taking what we now have. So people talk about one state solution, a two-state solution. What we have now is one state. There's between, to go back to use that expression, between the river and the sea, there is only one state. And as not just me, as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have also said, it's an apartheid state. That's what the reality is. So my personal point of view is that we should transform that apartheid state into a state of equal citizens and let everybody be treated equally. Jews, Muslims, Christians, whatever, let everybody be treated equally and call it a day. That's what I think should happen. So federations become, they sort of an incremental, in theory, an incremental step towards that. But as I said, if you leave intact positions of power, then you're not really dismantling the structures of power that led us to where we are.
How can we build a platform for open discussion on Israel-Palestine on campuses?
Well, by turning to university leaderships and asking them to protect our academic freedom. As I said, if we have an environment where people can speak their minds and they can argue and they can debate and so forth, there shouldn't be any problem. The problem is, again, I can't speak to Canada, but in the US, the problem is that, for example, there are literally 33 separate organizations bound together in the Israel on Campus Coalition that monitor American university campuses, and as we know from an article in The Nation last week, that actively spy on American university students. Why does this coalition exist? Why do our campuses need to be, and our students need to be subjected to surveillance and doxing and intimidation, things like that? Just let go of campus and let people think for themselves, and as I said, they'll find the true path, but not everybody's interested in them finding the true path.
Do you know of a similar case of denial in other colonial occupations? How did it end?
There have been other forms of denial, but if you look at other similar situations, for example, Australia, Canada, the US, I mean, this event tonight began with a very proper acknowledgement of land acknowledgement, right? Or if you go to any event in Australia, they begin right away with their version of land acknowledgement, which is a welcome to country, which is usually done by somebody from a First Nations perspective in Australia. But other settler colonial projects like this one here, or the one in the US, or the one in Australia, can now acknowledge that there are a First Nations, that another set of sovereignties exist here, that this land is contested and so forth. People here can wrap their minds around the existence of First Nations. In Israel, for literally decades, there's been a denial that the Nakba took place at all, that there are even Palestinians at all. So we're talking about different wavelengths here of forms of denial. But the other really interesting example, I think, is South Africa. Because the version of apartheid, obviously from which we get the name in South Africa, is one of the major differences between that version of apartheid and the one in Israel is that the South African one was out in the open. It spoke its name. It had a name, apartheid. It didn't deny that that's what it was. It said, yes, this is apartheid. And and segregation was absolutely everywhere. It was visible in all kinds of conditions and circumstances, as was, for example, in the Jim Crow system of segregation in the U.S. So you don't really find versions of apartheid or colonialism or settler colonialism that engage in denial in the way that the Zionist project does. There's much more kind of open acknowledgement of these situations in other contexts.
Okay. A question from somebody from our virtual audience. Gaza Strip has a common border as well with Egypt. However, Israel is blamed that they turned Gaza into a giant prison. Why the Gaza inhabitants are not using border with Egypt for free circulation?
Well, strictly speaking, Gaza doesn't have borders. Neither does Israel, for that matter. Just strictly speaking, because Israel has never declared its borders. So that's one thing. So Gaza is militarily occupied because the Israelis control its airspace, its territorial waters, and all kinds of ingress and egress into and out of it. So there is a border checkpoint at Rafah in the southern part of Gaza, which connects to Egypt. But because of the way in which colonial power functions, the Israelis, through the Americans, control Egypt and therefore indirectly control that border crossing as well. Nothing crosses into or out of Gaza without Israel's permission, including on the Egyptian border.
Okay. This one is really asking you to stretch yourself. In your opinion, what does the future of Gaza look like?
The future, like the immediate future or the long future?
I'm assuming whatever you would like
I think,
it to be.
honestly, I think at some point I think that what we're seeing now, both in Gaza and in the West Bank and Jerusalem and everywhere else for that matter, is unsustainable. I just don't think a state can continue to function with this level of violence on a daily basis, open-endedly. I just don't think I don't think it's sustainable. In fact, we're talking about Gaza. I've been talking about Gaza too, but if we look at what's been happening in the West Bank for the past 5 or 6 weeks as well, there's an extraordinary intensification of the forms of violence taking place in the Israeli-controlled West Bank. Not on the scale of Gaza, but nevertheless, just as violent in many, many cases. And so the state project that we have, this is the point. We have to think about this constantly. The state project before us is one that has used violence from the beginning. In 1948, this state could not have come into existence without violence. You can't persuade 900,000 people to get up and leave their homes without using violence against them and using violence to keep them from going back. You can't maintain a state of exclusive rights for one people in a land that has roughly equal populations of another people too. You need violence. So the choice before us, it seems to me, is either constant, continuous, unending violence, including what happened on October 7th. People get mad. Some people get mad. The Israelis get mad. When Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said that October 7th didn't happen in a vacuum, they were like, you can't say that. Well, it didn't happen in a vacuum, I'm sorry. It did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a context and a history. Everything takes place in a context and a history. And if one doesn't like the events of October 7th, I don't, well, then you have to stop the conditions that produced it, not the symptom. You have to go after the cause. And the cause is unceasing violence. That's the reality we're in. So I don't think it's possible for a state to open-endedly live in this condition of unceasing violence. I think something has to give at some point, and I think that something will come with the erosion of support for it in the West.
Okay. How would Western liberal values such as free speech become reconciled with these events once the war is over?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay. How would Western...
Which is not your reading of it, Doug. I think it's the
yeah, no, well, I'm also bad at reading handwriting, too. I should have been a pharmacist. Try another one here. Why would Hamas start a war leading to the death and destruction of 1,200 Israelis, 13,000 Palestinians in this day and age?
Well, I answered that a second ago, which is to say, first of all, it's not a war. No. I mean, again, yes, I'm an English professor, and so hence the English language matters to me, maybe more than to other people. But words have meanings. War is something that takes place between two states. This state can go to war against that state. Gaza is not a state. It is militarily occupied territory. So the power that has ultimate sovereignty over the space of Gaza is Israel. So Israel can't be at war with itself. This isn't a civil war. This is a conflict between an occupying power and an occupied people. So what Hamas did on October 7th, it did in the context of a 7-decade-long military occupation. That's the context in which it happened. As I said, if you don't like what Hamas did on October 7th, end the occupation, dismantle the system of apartheid, and hey, like magic, there won't be that kind of violence. That violence is there's nothing special about, I said this in a lunch session today, there's nothing unique or unusual or special or magical or distinctive about Palestine or the Palestinians. What's happening in Palestine has happened in many, many, many other places around the entire world. And there's nothing unique about this. In every single other instance, where there has been settler colonial or even just plain old colonial domination, there has been violence. It is in the nature of colonialism to be violent. And the context that colonialism produces is a situation of more and more and more violence until the situation of colonialism is ended. There's nothing special about Palestine. There's nothing unusual about Hamas. There's nothing unique about Palestinians. There's nothing unique about Israelis. This is a settler colonial conflict, and there have been lots of other settler colonial conflicts, and we know the trajectory of them, we know the path that they take, and if people want to have truth and reconciliation, they have to end the conditions of violence that produce the violence that we witnessed on October 7th. And that's basically all there is to it. It's not very complicated.
Good. We have time for a few more, and I've just received a bunch. I'm just going to quickly try and get some that kind of extend the conversation. How do you regard the 2 million Israeli Arabs who live as citizens in Israel?
They are not Israeli Arabs, they are Palestinians. And to begin to understand them, you have to understand these are Palestinians. They are as Palestinian as the Palestinians of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Palestinians in refugee camps, and the Palestinians in Gaza. The Palestinians are one people. They're not 23 people, they're one people. The Israelis have broken the Palestinians up into different constituent pieces. The largest single piece is the people who have been living in exile since 1948 and their descendants. Then there are people in the West Bank, people in East Jerusalem, people in Gaza, and then the Palestinian citizens of Israel. As I just told you, the Palestinian citizens of equal are second-class citizens. They do not have access to the same range of rights as their Jewish fellow citizens. And this is so constitutionally, juridically, institutionally, and legally speaking. If you don't believe me, look up the 2018 Jewish nation-state law, which is one of Israel's basic laws, which means it has constitutional characteristics, and you can read it for yourselves. You don't have to have a PhD in philosophy to understand that law. It's very, very, very simple. It says that sovereignty is unique to the Jewish people between the river and the sea. That's what it says. So again, that's the legal system that Palestinian citizens are subject to. So, for example, a Canadian, somebody who's a Jewish Canadian, to me, it's kind of mind-boggling. If you're a Jewish Canadian or a Jewish American, and you go to Israel, or for that matter, interestingly also, if you go to the West Bank, you have more rights in terms of accessing land than a Palestinian citizen of either the state or the occupied territories. Which is to say, somebody who's Jewish but not a citizen, under certain circumstances, has rights that trump those of somebody who's a citizen but isn't Jewish. That is in the nature of the state. This is again, the state itself says, it's not me, it's what the state itself says. It's been sanctified by the High Court in the 1970s. So people are going to have to grow up and wrap their minds around this reality. We're dealing with a racial state that discriminates along racial lines. That's what this is. And again, if we want violence to stop, we have to dismantle the structures of racism. There is no alternative to that.
Okay. In order to change these structures that impose denial and genocide, does one seek to exist within the system, which I would put in brackets, liberal democracy, and change it within, or seek to establish a new system?
Well, I think what we need is the reconstitution of a state that treats everybody equally, rather than a state that treats people unequally. If that's the choice, we're always told it's not very complicated. What this fundamentally boils down to is a struggle between a state system that is fundamentally premised on inequality, as opposed to people who are demanding equality. That's what this comes down to. And you do what you want. Take which side you want. You could be with those supporting inequality or with those supporting equality. I know where I stand. Everybody has to make up their mind for themselves.
Why does America keep aiding Israel, and how are they benefiting from Israel?
They are not benefiting from Israel. They are absolutely not benefiting. This does not benefit, it has never benefited the United States of America. The American government supports Israel because of domestic pressures. That's fundamentally what it comes down to, since the 1960s. And it's domestic pressures that keep this system of relations going. If you think about it, why would there need to be such a strong and powerful lobby in Washington to make sure that Washington supports what Israel wants, or it supports Israel's needs and so forth? For example, Germany and Britain or Canada don't have lobbies in Washington that do nearly anything like the work that the Israeli lobby does in Washington. Why? Well, because there's a much more natural affinity between Britain, Germany, America, and Canada, let's say, than there is between Israel and America. This is a relationship that needs to be constantly maintained, involving the constant hectoring and bullying of politicians or students or whatever, and constant lobbying, constant cajoling, constant involvement in elections and this kind of thing, constant harassment of students, constant surveillance, constant interruption. That's what it takes to sustain it. It's a completely unnatural relationship, and hence, what will change? Well, when the people change, the government will follow suit. And again, we have to look to the South African precedent. In the case of the dismantling of the South African system of apartheid in the 1980s, those of us who are old enough to remember it at the very tail end of it in the 1980s. And that was at the end of decades of struggle. And if you remember that transformation when Mandela was about to be released from jail, when South Africa was heading towards democracy, the very last minute, or up until the very last minute, Western governments, I don't know about Canada, but certainly the US and the UK, were still steadfastly in support of the system of apartheid. It was at the very last second that they changed their tune and they said, okay, we should dismantle apartheid and support a democracy. I think it'll be the same here. The people will lead the way and the governments will follow. That's what precedent tells us.
Okay. As a segue to that, into the last question, a question from the floor. As students on campus, how would you suggest we combat Israeli propaganda?
Ignore it. Just say just speak the truth, really, and just don't pay attention to them. Let them say what they want to say to whoever they want to say it to. And what you'll find out is nobody's paying attention to them, really. Their audience is dwindling very rapidly. And just investigate what's happening. Go learn for yourselves, study for yourselves, think for yourselves, read for yourselves, talk for yourselves,
and just ignore them, basically. Sorry, I mean, that's fundamentally what it comes down to.
And I've been asked to make a quick announcement before I again formally thank Professor Makdisi, and that is our colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier University are having a event on polarization next Sunday, not encouraging people to come out and polarize, but it's a discussion about polarization and religion. That's next Sunday at Laurier, November 26th at 12:30 p.m. It's a brochure if anybody's interested. We also have a reception now to start, so I encourage you to come and join and discuss this evening's talk. And if you just ask you to join with me and thank Professor Makdisi for a stimulating discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
And unfortunately, I didn't get to ask you my question, but we'll do that.